Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Dan Trotter, Pretty Good Bible Studies. The video that you're about to see is the first in a series of videos concerning dispensationalism. It is a part of my playlist, which is called New Covenant Theology. In that playlist, I will try to define what I think is the proper theology, which explains the connection between the Old Testament and the New Testament. There are two other theologies that attempt to do this, and I think erroneously. One is covenant theology, and the other is dispensational theology. I've already done 6 videos on covenant theology, and now I'm going to start off with new covenant theology. Oops, I meant to say I'm getting ready to start on dispensationalist videos, not new covenant theology videos. I won't do new covenant theology videos until the end of the playlist. Here's the thumbnail. You can check out these videos on YouTube if you so desire. Now, this particular video will give an introduction and history to dispensationalism. I hope you enjoy it. All right, here we go. The history of dispensationalism. Now, I've got this, my PowerPoints are divided into parts A, B, and C because dispensationalism is a little bit complicated, and it's going to take me 3 PowerPoints to get through them. So let's begin. I've divided my whole presentation of dispensationalism up into 5 parts. I'm going to give you an introduction and history in this video, and then in future videos, I'm going to talk about dispensationalism's literal hermeneutic. I like to call it hyperliteral. And then we're going to talk about the famous gaps of dispensationalism, especially the gap which the church is, according to them. And then we're going to talk about their idea of the eternal segregation of Israel and the church, a key facet of dispensationalism. And then I'm going to talk about a modern movement called progressive dispensationalism, which retreats from some of the more egregious areas of dispensationalism and moves further toward New Covenant theology position. So let's get started now with the introduction and history of dispensationalism. All right, now I'm going to divide this into 6 subparts, and the first subpart is we're going to talk about what dispensationalism tries to answer. I'll give you a hint, the same thing that covenant theology and New Covenant theology tries to answer. We're going to look at this profound question: are dispensationalists heretics? I would never even begin to call a dispensationalist a heretic, but certain Reformed big shot scholars have done that, and so we'll need to look at that. I'm going to look at the implications of dispensationalism, and they're serious. I believe it's a serious error. And I'm going to look at the history of dispensationalism and its divisions, its theological divisions, because there are different forms of dispensationalism. And then I'm going to look at the famous 3 fundamental principles of dispensationalism. But right now, let's look at what dispensationalism tries to answer. And as I said, it's the problem, the old problem of continuity and discontinuity between the old and new covenants. Now, I got a good quote here from Henry Chadwick, who wrote a small volume on the early church, very famous volume. I've used it to teach church history in college before. And he says this on page 285: the central questions of the apostolic age turned on the continuity or discontinuity of the church with Israel. Well, that bedeviling problem is still bothering the church now, 2 millennia later. The problem of continuity or discontinuity. You'll see that phrase all the time in theological discussions. Well, let's see how people have tried to deal with that issue. As I said, the issue is still with us today because there are 3 theological systems that attempt to deal with the issue today. The first is covenant theology, which started roughly in the 16th century and codified in the Westminster Confession of Faith. Oops, I meant to say in the 17th century, not the 16th century. I've just done 6 videos on covenant theology. Dispensationalism, which showed up in the 19th century, early 19th century, and then New Covenant theology, which showed up in the mid to late 20th century. So these are your 3 options. There are no other options in modern day theology on how to solve this problem of how does the Old Testament relate with the New Testament? Does it just continue straight on into the New Testament with no change? Is the relationship between the covenants flat? That's what the covenant theologians try to tell us. Or is it completely discontinuous, as the dispensationalists tell us, because the church age has nothing to do with the Old Testament? It's a gap. It's parentheses. The prophets in the Old Testament and the law was pointing forward to the millennium, which is after the church age. So they're your two extremes. Reformed is completely continuous, and dispensationalists say that the relationship between the covenants is completely discontinuous. The correct view, which I will call the New Covenant theology view, which I will call the correct view, says that the relationship is partially continuous and partially discontinuous. Partially continuous because the Old Testament types and prophecies pointed to fulfillment in Jesus during the church age and not to the millennium, but partially discontinuous in the fact that Jesus established a new law. He elevated the law of Moses, and he's a new lawgiver, which the covenant theologians don't admit. So there's the issue in a nutshell. So now let's look at the next question. Are dispensationalists heretics? Now, before I get started on this, we need to define heresy. Heresy is a word that's thrown around a lot. You know, people part the hair on the left side of the face instead of the right. Oh, you're a heretic. It's overused, kind of like the word racist by people in America, use the term racist so much that pretty soon there's no racist. There's no word that you could use to call a real racist a racist. Same thing with heretic. If you keep calling everybody a heretic that you disagree with, pretty soon there's no words left to describe a real heretic, which is unfortunate. But I've come up with a strict definition of heresy and a loose definition of heresy. The strict definition of heresy, according to me, is this: a deviation from the historic Christian faith so serious that, if believed, would deprive a person of salvation. In other words, heresy causes you to go to hell. Now, that's how I like to use the term. I don't use it very much, only if I can find somebody that's just completely outside the faith. And I know there's a lot of people that have a lot of screwy doctrines that are still Christians. They've still been born again by the Spirit of God, and they're going to be in heaven, but they're still screwy in their doctrine. But I don't call them a heretic. I just call them an errorist. Now, here's a loose definition of heresy. Quote, a serious deviation from the historic Christian faith with grave theological implications. Now, if you want to use that definition, I would say, yeah, the dispensationalists fit. Under a strict definition, dispees are not heretics. They're saved. Some of the nicest people and the most dedicated Christians you'll ever find are dispensationalists. My two grandmothers were dispensationalists. So I know all about dispensationalists. I grew up with dispensationalists. Dispensationalists trained me in my early high school and college years, until I got involved in the charismatic movement and realized dispensationalists were trying to deny the obvious, that they say that miracles don't exist in the first century. And I saw miracles happening, and so I chunked dispensationalism. But I would never, ever say that a dispensationalist was a heretic. They're not. They're Christians. You'll see them in heaven. Now, under the loose definition that heresy is a serious deviation with grave theological implications. Oh, yeah. And on that definition, dispees are heretics. But I'm not even going to use the word heretics. I'm going to say they're errorist. They're wrong. I would never call a dispensationalist a heretic. Now, John Gerstner, the famous Reformed theologian who was sort of a bulldog when it came to theological polemics, he put it in a book, a famous book, where he quotes dispensationalists. He cites dispensationalists as heretics. Meredith Kline, I understand, also did the same thing. These are two big shot Reformed theologians, and I think that's unfortunate, and I think that's going too far. All right, let's look at the third issue as we introduce dispensationalism, is the implications of dispensationalism. Now, the implications are quite momentous here. A, B, C, and D. First, Christians are robbed of parts of the New Testament. When you make the New Testament a gap in a parenthesis, that means you take away things. You make it empty. For example, spiritual gifts. This is where I first encountered dispensationalism, when they were trying to tell me that spiritual miraculous gifts, tongues, prophecy, and miracles did not exist except in the first century. They didn't exist in the 20th century in which I lived, and I knew that was nonsense. So they were trying to rob me of spiritual gifts. In fact, I remember there was a great book written by some charismatic guy called We've Been Robbed. I've lost the book, and he disappeared into church history. But the book was great because it was absolutely true. Dispensationalists were trying to they have helped rob the church of spiritual gifts. They also rob the church of the kingdom of God. I mean, if the church is a parenthesis and a gap, a nothing burger, Jesus said the church was the kingdom of God. That's where Christians live with God as our king in a spiritual commonwealth with lots and lots of spiritual benefits. Oh, that doesn't count. I have to wait to the millennium, the so-called millennium, thousands of years in the future, or however long in the future it's going to be before I get these benefits. No, I'm living in the kingdom now. That's easy to show, but dispensationalists don't believe it. So that's a big implication right there if you believe in dispensationalism. There's also the danger of Israelolatry, which I've labeled as part B here, because dispensationalists say that all the prophets pointed to Israel, not the church, and so pretty soon Israel becomes the focus of all their theology. There's also a danger, C here, of Christian defeatism, because their peculiar eschatology is extremely pessimistic. Pre-trib rapture, things get so bad that nuclear bombs start falling. There's a 10-nation Roman Empire in 2000 that's going to set up a kingdom of the Antichrist, and then there's a 200 million man army from China that's going to come invading Europe, and the nuclear bombs are going to start falling, and there's going to be plague and pestilence and famine, and we've got to polish the rails on a sinking ship because Christianity is a sinking ship. And who wants to be a member of a church like that? Well, we'll talk about that later. That's where their eschatology tends to go, and so I don't like Christian defeatism. I like Christian victory. Fourth implication of dispensationalism triumphs: the church is wrongly de-emphasized. In other words, as I said, the church becomes a gap. Instead of the glorious church, as I think in Ephesians Paul calls the church the glorious church, the dispensationalists call the church a gap, a parenthesis, a vacuum. So you see, dispensationalism is serious business, and it's everywhere in America. It's dying, fortunately, but sometimes it takes a snake a long time to die. Oh, I shouldn't have said that. Sometimes it takes bad theologies and bad philosophies a long time to die. Kind of like apartheid in South Africa. I read somewhere that apartheid was dead decades before it officially disappeared. People weren't believing in it a long time before it disappeared. But what happens is it gets codified in the institutions of a society, and you can't get rid of it. Well, same thing with dispensationalism. It has been codified in the evangelical institutions of America, many of them, and as a result, can't get rid of it. One day, it will. I'm convinced it will go. All right, let me summarize the four problems that happens when if dispensationalism triumphs. First, Christians are robbed. Spiritual gifts are not in our present dispensation. The kingdom of God is the millennium, not the church, so we're robbed. Letter B here, we end up in a danger of Israelolatry, worshiping Israel instead of Jesus. How many times have you heard dispensationalists get carried away with their eschatology and Israel? Well, where's Jesus? This makes it difficult to witness to Muslims, of course, because they don't care about Israel, and Jews. They care about their own religion. It makes it difficult to be politically even-handed in the Middle East, even when it's in America's foreign policy interest to do so. Now, I'm going to say right now, I love Israel. I even thought I'd like to live there. I visited there. I support them over all these anti-Semitic divest Israel, don't invest in Israel movements that's in the left wing now of American politics. There was even one guy that was so pro-Muslim and anti-Jewish that Alan Dershowitz, the famous liberal Democrat lawyer at Harvard, law professor at Harvard Law School, said he would leave the Democrat Party if this anti-Semite ever made it to the top of the Democratic Party. Fortunately, he didn't. But I say all that to say that I don't want to identify with Jew haters, with anti-Semites, with left-wing Democrats, with the people in Europe. Anti-Semitism is running rampant through Europe. If you read the newspapers and the intellectual journals, and just the popular culture is becoming very anti-Semitic. And I don't want to identify with that. But on the other hand, if it's necessary to be nice to Saudi Arabia, I hate to say Saudi Arabia because I don't like Saudi Arabia, but if it's necessary for foreign policy, we got to do what we got to do and not let theology get in the way of politics. The third problem with if dispensationalism triumphs is Christian defeatism. A defeated church longingly looks for the millennium. That's exactly what dispensationalism leads to. And the reason I'm speaking so confidently about this is because I was raised in dispensationalism. I know exactly what it leads to. Dispensationalism leads to the idea that a defeated church is a mere gap between the Old Testament and the New Testament. I'll tell you when this really became real to me. There was a Christian lawyer in Columbia, South Carolina. I still remember his name. I won't give it. But he was a big Republican in the South Carolina Republican Party. And he was a fundamentalist Christian, a dispensationalist Christian, pre-trib, rapture, pre-mill, all that stuff. And I knew that. And he was a delegate to some convention somewhere, and I was too. And I went to him, and I said, I was just a college kid. And I said, sir, how can you get involved in politics if you know that we're going to get beat? Because he was talking about the one world government and how, the church is going to go down and the typical dispensationalist gloom and doom. So I asked him, I said, why do you even get involved in politics if you think that it's all going to hell? And you know what he told me? He said, because when they come, and I guess I don't know when they was either the Antichrist or political liberals, I don't know, secularists. But he said, when they come to get me, and when they come to drag me out of my living room, I can turn around and look at my daughter and say, honey, I tried. And right then I said, to Gehenna with dispensationalism, to Gehenna with this pre-trib, pre-rapture, Hal Lindsey, bullshitki, because that's exactly what it is. It is Christian defeatism. I read a book one time by Marcellus Kick, published in early 1970s, called An Eschatology of Victory. And that's how I reacted against this incident with this fundamentalist pre-trib lawyer, and ended up being a post-mill. I'm not totally optimistic. There's been a lot of stereotypes about post-millennialism. I just believe that the gospel is going to triumph. We're going to have a lot of battles and a lot of temporary defeats, and it's going to be difficult, and life is still going to be hard in this vale of tears. But by golly, we're going to win. We're not going to lose. All right, enough of that. Part D, if dispensationalism triumphs, the church is wrongly de-emphasized. The focus of salvation history is a 1,000-year golden age in the future, the millennium. But isn't the focus of the Bible really the church that was bought by Jesus' blood? I mean, the purpose of the book of Acts was to establish the church, not to establish a millennial kingdom. I mean, my gosh, the millennium is mentioned one time in Acts chapter 20. And even then, you can't prove it's a pre-mill, the nature of the millennium. Oops, I meant to say that the millennium is mentioned in Revelation chapter 20, not Acts chapter 20. Let's move on. Implications are severe. Let's look at the history of the history of dispensationalism. Here's a nice picture of John Darby, and here are 5 stages of dispensationalism, and we're going to use a metaphor here, a metaphor of the growth of a human being. The first stage is conception. The error was conceived between 1819 and 1864 by this guy, John Darby, right here. The second stage was incubation and infancy as it grew, 1864 to 1909. I'll show you the significance of these dates in just a minute. They do have significance. The third stage is the youth of the movement between 1909 and 1950. The fourth stage is the maturation of the movement between the 1950 and the 1990s. And of course, that's when I was a young, impressionable Christian, right at the mature high point of dispensationalism. And I think that's why I'm reacting against it so strongly. Now, the fifth stage, which we'll call the middle age of dispensationalism, is the 1980s to the present, as just like human beings in their middle age start to break down. I can testify to that. Dispensationalism is starting to break down. I'm about to have a hallelujah breakdown when I think about it. They are. In fact, well, I'll get to that later. All right, let's start first of all in the first stage of the history of dispensationalism, conception, 1819 to 1864. All right, John Darby was an Anglican. He protested the dead Anglican Church in England, just like dispensationalists today protest the dead Protestant piles of garbage that the liberal Protestant churches are in America. So dispensationalism tends to have this anti-establishment flair to it, which I identify with because I don't like the established churches either at all. So he had a legitimate complaint, But he came up with this theology which tended to jerk the church out of the New Testament and make it a gap, make it nothing, and focus the good stuff on the future millennium, so he didn't have to deal with the bad stuff in the present, which was the dead Anglican Church. Now, here's some of his beliefs. First of all, he believed that Christians' heavenly blessings were distinct from earthly Jewish blessings. So he made the Bible point to earthly blessings for Jews on earth, so he didn't have to focus on how crappy Christians' lives were on earth. He says, well, we're going to get our happiness in heaven. The Jews are going to get happy on earth. So you see that segregation between Christians and Jews. He believed in an any moment pre-tribulation rapture. In other words, Jesus is going to come snatch us out of all the hell that's going on at the end of the history. Near the end of history, there's going to be 7 years of hell, but we're not going to be in it. 7 years of tribulation, and we're going to get snatched out, and then Jesus is going to come back to set up his millennial kingdom at the end of that 7 years, and he's going to get the rest of the Christians who are saved during the tribulation. All of this is absolute nonsense. It's made up. In fact, the interesting thing, Darby got this from a vision from a charismatic girl. Now, you know, a lot of charismatic visions are nuts. I'm not a cessationist. Justin Peters. I'm not a cessationist. John MacArthur. I think cessationism is absolute bunkum. I'm a charismatic myself. Just like Paul the Apostle, he was a charismatic, all right? He spoke in tongues, and I do too, all right? However, having said that, there are a lot of charismatics who come up with nutty visions. There's a lot of them. Well, this girl came up with a vision, and she described the pre-tribulation rapture. And Darby bought it. Her name was Margaret MacDonald. The Incredible Cover-Up was the book that was written that revealed this. Now, I know there's some controversy behind this book, but I believe it. It wouldn't surprise me that this is what happened. It's ironic because dispensationalists are so anti-charismatic, and yet they got their pre-trib rapture theory from a charismatic girl. Just like it's ironic that present-day dispensationalists are anti-charismatic, and yet Dwight L. Moody believed in a baptism of the Holy Spirit subsequent to conversion, which a lot of people don't know. All right, so going back to Darby, he divided biblical history into 7 dispensations. Now, I've listed up Darby's 7 dispensations. Now, let me just tell you, dispensationalists are always dividing history up into dispensationalists, into dispensations, and they don't agree with each other. And they give them different names, and I don't care, because I don't believe it to start with. But even if you did believe it, you got to pick and choose which one you're going to believe. From Eden to Noah's flood, then Noah, then Abraham, then Israel, then the Gentiles, and the age of the Spirit, and the age of the millennium. Okay, those are 7 dispensations. So that's where the idea of dispensations came from, was Darby, and the pre-trib rapture theory came from Darby. He was a seminal figure in church history. Now, we'll go to the second stage of the history of dispensationalism, incubation and infancy, between 1864 and 1909. Why those strange, uneven dates? Because in 1864, and 1865, John Darby made 2 visits to the United States. And he visited James H. Brooks, picture of him right here, who was a pastor of Walnut and 16th Street Presbyterian Church in St. Louis. And this Presbyterian church became the center of dispensationalism, which is again ironic, because Reformed people despise dispensationalism today, and yet dispensationalism's greatest impact was among Presbyterians. Sort of weird. Dispensationalism is intertwined with the history of charismatics and the history of Presbyterians, both of whom really, really don't like dispensationalism. Now, Brooks was important because he taught C.I. Scofield. Now, he's the guy that wrote the famous Scofield Bible, which we'll talk about in a minute. The first version of that Bible was published in 1909. So there you get dates. 1864, Darby comes to teach Brooks in St. Louis. And then in 1909, C.I. Scofield publishes his first Scofield Bible. Now, of course, dispensationalism sort of under the radar here as it's growing up and people are spreading its doctrine through papers and talking and so forth. But then conferences started. This is usually what happens. Let me back up here a minute. The Bible conference movement started in 1870s as people started getting together to talk about all these new doctrines. They had the Niagara conferences, 1870s to 1900, and these are famous in American church history. The American Bible and prophetic conferences, you see how prophecy was closely intertwined with dispensationalism, that pre-trib, pre-mill stuff. Those conferences were held between 1878 and 1914. So post-Civil War, pre-World War I, American Christianity was very, very much influenced by dispensationalism. Then, after they moved from conferences, the movement began to be institutionalized as Bible institutes were set up, schools. They were not really colleges yet, but they were institutes. The Nyack Bible Institute, which is still around, I think, has probably changed its name in 1882, the Boston Missionary Training School in 1889, and, most famous of all, Moody Bible Institute, 1889. Now, all of these, I've got Moody in red, they have had a huge influence of spreading this dispensational doctrine. And by the way, this is sort of a comment. People like to say, well, I don't want to set up Bible schools because, they always go liberal and they're a waste of time. Well, I don't know. That these Bible schools have made a big impact. One reason the charismatic movement has had so much trouble is there's no charismatic Bible schools to speak of. And the movement's been taken over by nut jobs like Bill Johnson, Kenneth Copeland. A good theological defense can be made of charismatic phenomena and pneumatology, but there's no Bible schools backing it up. But the dispensationalists, they had them, and they've had a huge impact. All right, now let's go to the third stage of dispensationalism, which is the youth of the movement between 1909 and 1950. The beginning of this period is 1909 because this man right here, C.I. Scofield, he published the Scofield Reference Bible. This has been the greatest popularizer of dispensationalism ever. I mean, even though it was a Bible with just notes in it, Reformed scholars will quote it all the time and go to the reference Bible and say, it's Scofield's note number so-and-so. In other words, it rose to the level of theological and scholarly importance. And everybody had a Scofield Reference Bible. I had one when I was young. And many people facetiously claimed that they thought the notes were inerrant and inspired because everybody was referring to those notes. And by the way, this is a good argument not to put notes in a Bible, at least not theological notes. All right, so he was a big gun in the youth of dispensationalism. C.I. Scofield, another big guy, was Louis Sperry Schaeffer. He was the first president of Dallas Theological Seminary, which was founded in 1924. DTS, they were famous for pushing dispensationalism, and their theology is predominant. I mean, there's so many people that are dispensationalists now because of this school. It used to be you had to sign a doctrinal statement to even get into the school. I think I read it one time as I was thinking about going to seminary. I was thinking, well, maybe I'll go down there and not agree with it, but, just see what they got. And no, you have to sign a statement. They might have changed that since then, but this was a long time ago. But they were very, very, very doctrinally founded on dispensationalism. And Louis Sperry Schaeffer was the first dispensationalist theologian. He published the first dispensational systematic theology. So here you have dispensationalism in its pristine purity, Louis Sperry Schaeffer, so you need to remember him. Now, as we go through these videos, I'm going to take this extreme, foundational, original form of dispensationalism because just for teaching purposes, it's clear, it's separate, there's no fudging, there's no compromise in dispensationalism when you're at these earlier stages. All right, now let's go to the fourth stage of dispensationalism, which is maturation of the movement. 1950s to 1990s, this is when it became, this is when I learned about it. Here are your three big theologians in this stage. They were theologians. They operated on a scholarly level. This is Charles Ryrie. The Ryrie Reference Bible, I think he was big for. John F. Walvoord wrote a bunch of books on theology and eschatology. And then J. Dwight Pentecost, another ironic name, Pentecost, since they were so anti-Pentecostal. I actually sat and listened to a lecture he gave at Expo 72 in 1972. I was bored to death. But he's a big shot in the movement. I might have been bored because I didn't like dispensationalism at the time, and I might have been prejudiced against what he was trying to say. I don't know, so I don't want to say he's boring all the time. Now, these gentlemen are called either revised or neo-dispensationalists, and the terminology is fuzzy. I just saw a website where progressive dispensationalists who come later, they are called revised dispensationalists. So they start chipping away at Louis Sperry Schaeffer, changing a few things. I'm really not clear on what they changed. It doesn't matter. The point is, we're going to look at dispensationalism in its pure form to contrast it with covenant theology and new covenant theology, and then we can worry about how the later dispensationalists have deviated from the early norm. All right, now let's go to the fifth stage, the middle age of dispensationalism. This is the 1990s to the present. This is what is called progressive dispensationalism. Happened in the 90s. There was a critical Atlanta meeting of the Evangelical Theological Society where dispensationalist theologians got together and said, hey, dispensationalism's got to be changed. It's not going to survive. It's not going to work the way it is. May God bless them. Now here are leading, I don't know if these guys were at the meeting or not, but these guys became the leading progressive dispensationalists. You will read their books, and their articles are all over the internet and are published. Craig A. Blasing, right here, I think that's how you pronounce his name, Blasing. I'm not dead sure, actually. This is Darrell L. Bach. I think he taught it, or is still teaching at Trinity. Oops, I meant to say that Darrell Bach is teaching at Dallas Theological Seminary, not Trinity Seminary, not Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. Saucy just died, Robert L. Saucy. I had one of his books when I was at Trinity Seminary, so he's a relatively old guy. I think it was called The Church in the Kingdom, or something about the church, and wasn't that good, to be honest with you. But anyway, these are three guys that are leading progressive dispensationalists. Now, well, I guess I ought to say what progressive dispensationalism did. Just briefly, we're going to get into this in more detail later, but briefly, they held on to the idea of a Jewish millennium. Actually, they held on to the idea of a premillennial millennium. I think some of them are saying that the millennium does not have to be Jewish, that it can have the Christian church in it. They got rid of all the idea about they have to be animal sacrifices in the millennium because there's got to be a literal fulfillment of the prophecies. Like in Ezekiel, it says that the animal sacrifices are coming back. So they got away with that hyperliteralism. What else? Jesus does not sit on the throne of David, but Jesus is not going to sit on the throne of David until we get to the millennium. No, Jesus is sitting on the throne of David right now in the church. So you see they're moving in the right direction toward new covenant theology and toward covenant theology. Now let's look at another separate question since we finished the 5 stages of dispensationalist history. Let's look at the question, did dispensationalism exist before the 19th century? Now, this is a big deal because critics of dispensationalists love to point out, hey, you mean to tell us that dispensationalism was totally lost to the church for 1,800 years and all of a sudden John Darby found it? Come on now. I've used that argument a lot. Now I realize that argument can be used against you sometimes in other issues. I've had it used against me when I talked about normative ecclesiology was New Testament house church Christianity, and people say, oh, that didn't exist. That just showed up. And I had to go back and had to look and find out that lots of people believed in that all throughout the centuries. It just got kind of submerged under the Catholic Church. And then Orthodox preterism, that was started by the Catholic Jet. No, it wasn't. You could go back into into early church history, and you could find people who believed Orthodox preterist ideas. But ladies and gentlemen, you can't do that with dispensationalism. It did not exist before the 19th century, even though they claim it did. Now, here's what they say. They say that dispensationalists did not exist as a system. I'm quoting Charles Ryrie here, the big neo-dispensationalist, the revised dispensationalist. He said he admits that dispensationalism did not exist as a system. He said, however, there were outlines that were found in the early church. That's like when covenant theologians say they're adumbrations of covenant theology before the Westminster Confession of Faith and before the Reformation and during the Reformation. Adumbrations. That means shadowy outlines. And I said in that video, and I'll say here, whenever you see a theologian say that there's an outline or an adumbration of their theology in early church history, that means one thing. It does not exist. It's not there. It says nothing. Because it's so easy to find somebody that says something that's sort of what you believe in. Oh, see, there it is. Embryonic form of my theology. Nonsense. Well, why does this matter? Well, if you say no, there's no dispensationalism before the 19th century, but dispensationalism looks very bad. It looks like a novelty, a chronological conceit, creative theology, which I like just about as much as I like creative accounting. Now, what dispensationalists often say to get around this charge is they say premillennialism existed before the 19th century. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that is a misleading statement. It is true that dispensationalists were pre-mills, but the historic pre-mills back in the early church century were not dispensationalists. They agreed with the dispensationalists about premillennialism, but there was a lot of other stuff they didn't agree with, or they never heard of, like the pre-trib rapture theory, for example. This is misleading to say that premillennialism existed before the 19th century, thus proving that dispensationalism existed before the 19th century is misleading because the early premillennialism was not dispensational premillennialism. Now I'm going to give you a great quote because you need to know about this guy because he was a Dallas Seminary graduate. In fact, he was writing, I think it was his master's thesis at Dallas. His name is Alan Patrick Boyd. He was a dispensationalist, and he's decided to research this claim that dispensationalism existed as the historic faith of the church. Now, here's a quote from Alan Patrick Boyd. Quote, "It would seem wise for the modern system," that means dispensationalism, "to abandon the claim that it is the historic faith of the church." Hear, hear. Here's what the early church fathers did not believe, but which dispensationalists do believe. The early church fathers did not believe in a literal interpretation of Scripture. They believed in an allegorical form of Scripture. They did not believe in a difference between the church and Israel. They believed that the church was the new Israel, the fulfillment of prophecies and types in the Old Testament about the church. They didn't believe in dispensations. That was made up by Darby in the 1800s. They didn't believe in imminency, that Jesus is going to come back all of a sudden when nobody's going to know when. They didn't believe in the pre-tribulation rapture at the end of time, the 7-year tribulation that Christians are going to be jerked out before so that we don't have to go through it. That's all modern 1800 stuff. And folks, I'm telling you something. Christians can make a lot of mistakes, but you can't tell me that nobody sees this. If it's so obvious, how did Christians miss it for 1800 years? This is dispensationalism, my friends. It's not a heresy. I won't call it a heresy, but it is utter nonsense. It is nonsense. It is a theological novelty that has misled so many people and has brainwashed so many Christians that it's hard to even talk about the Bible with people that believe this stuff because they can't understand the Bible. They're so screwed up with their rose-colored dispensationalist glasses. All right, now that we've talked about the history of the movement, let's talk about the divisions of the movement, theological divisions. First of all, we have classic dispensationalists. This is John Darby, who I just mentioned, early 1800s. Louis Sperry Schaeffer, founder of DTS, Dallas Theological Seminary, which was founded in 1924. You got John Walvoord, who is, I've got him listed here as a classic dispensationalist. He was the second president of Dallas Theological Seminary, and C.I. Schofield, editor of the Schofield Reference Bible. Some people put Walvoord up here in the revised neo-dispensationalist, I think. Ultra-dispensationalists, these even dispensationalists think are whacked out. They're considered major errorists by dispensationalists. And the way you remember these people, they think the Sermon on the Mount is not for Christians. That's for the kingdom age, the millennium, not for Christians, which is utter, absolute nonsense. Even the dispensationalists agree with that. Then the revised or the neo-dispensationalist, 1950 to 1990 or so, that last part of the 20th century, J. Dwight Pentecost, Charles Ryrie. Here's another one I didn't mention earlier, Charles Feinberg. He is the founder of Talbot Theological Seminary. He had two sons, Paul, who was my professor at Trinity Seminary. He unfortunately died of heart failure in the early 2000s. And John Feinberg, who's still there, and Alva J. McLean. These are famous dispensationalism. Now, they moderated classic dispensationalism a little. I don't even remember exactly how they do it, and they probably do it in different ways. And you have to be a dispensationalist expert to make these distinctions. I'm not such an expert. I don't want to be such an expert, but I'll just mention this, that they do change a little bit of the hardcore dispensationalism of Darby and Schaeffer. Now, progressive dispensationalists, those are the ones, they've taken over Dallas Seminary now. I think they've taken over Moody Bible Institute. I can't remember. I think they have. They made great progress, let's put it this way, in the old bastions of classic dispensationalism and revised dispensationalism. They have moderated classic dispensationalism a lot, and in fact, I read their stuff and I say, well, I almost agree with all of it. The only thing I don't agree with is this pre-mill Jewish, well, this pre-millennium. They don't even say it's totally Jewish. They say that there's Christians in that millennium, I think. And of course, they disagree with one another. And sometimes it's hard to get a hard statement about a new movement that everybody in that movement agrees with. But that's generally the idea. I mean, they really have knocked off a lot of the classic dispensationalism, which to me is wonderful news. Now let's look at the three fundamental principles of dispensationalism to get us set up for our dive into dispensational theology. Three fundamental principles. Number one, Israel and the church are forever separated. Eternal segregation of Israel and the church is what I call it, because the Old Testament points to Israel, not the church. It points to the millennium, which is a Jewish millennium. It doesn't point to the church. Second fundamental principle of dispensationalism is its hyperliteral hermeneutic. I mean, if it says that a star fell on the rivers and a third of the earth was burned up, by golly, that's literal. It happened. All that eschatological rhetoric in the book of Revelation, it's literal. The moon's going to turn to blood. And then, of course, gaps in salvation history is the third fundamental principle of dispensationalism. There's a gap between the Old Testament and the millennium, and that gap is called the church. We're going to go into each one of these fundamental principles in great detail so that you will understand dispensationalism. Now let's take the first fundamental principle. Israel and the church are forever separated. Eternal segregation of Israel and the church. Here's a quote from Charles Ryrie, the great dispensationalist theologian. He says this: a dispensationalist keeps Israel and the church distinct. This is probably the most basic theological test of whether or not a person is a dispensationalist. The one who fails to distinguish Israel and the church consistently will inevitably not hold to dispensational distinctions, and the one who does will. So there you have it. It's big. Israel and the church have got to be separated out of the words of the dispensationalist mouth. Using the words of the dispensationalist mouth. Second principle, hyperliteral hermeneutics. All texts are literal unless it's impossible to take otherwise. So with dispies, it is almost always possible to take it literally. Almost always. I mean, I remember one time I got a dispensationalist to admit that God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. I said, you mean on the 1,001st hill? He doesn't own the cattle? And he sat and he thought I was teaching at the time, and I was challenged from the congregation by this dispensationalist, and he thought. I said, "Yeah, that's metaphorical." Oh, he spiritualized the Bible. I couldn't believe it. It's hard to get them to do it. Now, and what really messes them up is they take prophetic texts literally. The moon will turn to blood. The stars will fall like figs from a fig tree and roll around on the ground, and the sky will be rolled up like a mantle, and the sun will be darkened, and all that stuff. They take it literally. This is exactly backwards. Prophetic texts were never meant to be taken literally. Go to Isaiah 13. All that prophetic literature, apocalyptic rhetoric is there as Isaiah prophesies, and it never happened literally. If it didn't happen with Isaiah 13, it doesn't happen in Matthew 24 either. All right, that's the third fundamental principle of dispensationalism is gaps in salvation history. The church is a parenthesis in God's plan for redeemed humanity. This follows from point number 2, the hyperliteral hermeneutic. Because the Old Testament prophets, if they're interpreted literally, they point to a Jewish kingdom because they always spoke in Jewish terms. That's all they knew. What was Jeremiah 31:31? I will make a new covenant for the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Well, they didn't know about the church, so he used the terms Israel and Judah, which is fulfilled in the church. But at any rate, anytime we get something, for example, a return to Israel from Babylon, all those return passages, that's talking about people coming into the millennium. So anyway, so when you get all this Jewish terminology in the Old Testament prophets, that means what they're pointing to has got to be Jewish. And since the church is not Jewish, we're going to have a Jewish millennium. You got the Old Testament prophets. Sometimes they prophesy about historical events right in front of their nose, maybe 50, 100 years or so. But then when they point a long time in the future, they point to the millennium mostly. This is according to dispensationalists. I don't know how they handle the prophecies that Jesus was going to be born in Bethlehem. How about the fallen tabernacle of David? Oh, that's going to be restored in the millennium when Peter at Pentecost referred it to the church. Well, they refer it to the millennium, for example. So here's how you have them fulfilling Old Testament prophecy, either in the Old Testament itself or in the future millennium. The church gets left out because it's a gap. All right, so much for introduction and overview of dispensationalism. In future videos, we're going to take up those 3 points. Dispensation's literal hermeneutic, the gaps, that was point 2, point 3, and here's point 1. I've got them in different order. Maybe there's a reason for that. Maybe it was a mistake. I don't remember. And then we're going to take up progressive dispensationalism so we can see where dispensationalism is today. Hope you check those videos out, and I hope you enjoyed this one.